What's up, everyone? It's the Law School Lumberjack. I hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to be doing a case brief on the case of Hunter and Syncrude. Now, in my previous video on fundamental breach, I briefly referenced this case, and I received several comments and messages from our viewers requesting that I go into this case in some detail in order to assist them in their courses. So, thank you to all you viewers, and without further ado, let's get into the case. So firstly, let's start off with the facts of this case. This case can be very difficult to follow because there's several different things that are going on and several different grounds of appeal or causes of action that are happening at the same time. So there's three parties essentially here. There's Syncrude, the buyer of the defective products. There's Hunter, who supplied the gearboxes. And there's a third party called Allis-Chalmers, who supplied basically the conveyor belts that included some of the gearboxes that Hunter supplied. So there's essentially two separate contracts here, or two separate contractual relationships. There's a relationship between Syncrude and Hunter, and there's a contractual relationship between Syncrude and Allis-Chalmers. So each of these contracts contained a warranty clause that essentially said that after a certain period of time, the warranty was extinguished, and Hunter or Allis-Chalmers, depending on what contract you're looking at, essentially were no longer responsible for any defects or any issues with the items they supplied after that period of time. So what happens in this case is the gearboxes are defective, and potentially as a result, the conveyor belt is also defective. However, this issue is discovered after the warranties expired. Now, what's really arguably confusing about this decision is that there's multiple parties and multiple causes of action, multiple grounds of appeal going on. So in this case, there's essentially three grounds of appeal. The first is from Hunter, essentially arguing that the warranty was expired, so they are no longer liable under the Ontario Sale of Goods Act. Because we're going to be focusing on fundamental breach and the topic of fundamental breach in this video, we're not going to go into great detail as to why Hunter was liable under the Sale of Goods Act, but essentially the court finds that yes, Hunter is liable on that ground of appeal. The second ground of appeal, which is the most important ground of appeal for the purposes of this video, and which I'll be focusing on this video, is whether or not Allis-Chalmers could rely on the warranty clause being extinguished to avoid liability, or whether fundamental breach rendered that clause unenforceable such that Syncrude could go after Allis-Chalmers for damages. The final ground of appeal, which again I won't go into in great detail because it doesn't really matter for the purposes of fundamental breach, deals with trust law. Essentially what happened was Syncrude was paying money into a trust with respect to what it owed to Hunter for the gearboxes, and that ground of appeal essentially revolved around whether or not Syncrude was entitled to the money or the money was essentially Hunter's. We won't go into that ground of appeal at all in this video because that deals with trust law. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to focus on the issues surrounding the Allis-Chalmers ground of appeal and focus on what the Supreme Court of Canada held with respect to the law surrounding fundamental breach in this case. So essentially what happens in this case is with respect to the outcome of the Allis-Chalmers appeal being whether or not they are liable to Syncrude, the court agrees they are not liable. However, the court disagrees on the reason for that. So Justice Dixon essentially holds that the doctrine of fundamental breach should no longer exist in Canadian law. Instead, what Justice Dixon holds is essentially that the court should look to only unconscionability and contract construction, and essentially should lay the entire doctrine of fundamental breach to rest. Now, the Honorable Justice Wilson, as I said, comes to the same conclusion with respect to the outcome as Justice Dixon, but takes a different route around coming to that conclusion. She essentially says that the case law goes in two different directions. There's the case that Justice Dixon relies on that essentially says that there should be no fundamental breach. And then there's some academic writings and case law that suggest that instead the court should take what's called a reasonableness approach. Now, Justice Wilson looks over the case law, the academic writings, and essentially says that she prefers something more similar to the reasonableness aspect than completely throwing out fundamental breach. However, she creates a dichotomy and essentially says if the parties have extremely different bargaining powers, what the court should do is look to the doctrine of unconscionability. However, if you recall from my other videos or cases that you've read in law school, such as Harold and Kreuziger, you'll know that unconscionability generally isn't available when two parties are at or near the same bargaining power. So Justice Wilson essentially says that while unconscionability covers a case where there's inequality of bargaining power, fundamental breach with a couple changes should exist in order to protect parties where there is equality of bargaining power and an unfair or unreasonable result would occur if there was an exclusion clause that was enforced or upheld. Essentially what Justice Wilson does is she basically says there's a residual ability for the court to determine there is fundamental breach if certain conditions apply. Being one, that the parties have equality of bargaining power. Two, that substantially all of the benefit to one party under the contract is deprived because of the breach. Three, where one party does an unfair or unjust act in the course of the contract and then essentially tries to rely on the exclusion of liability clause. And fourthly, where the court views it's in the interest of justice to intervene and hold that the exclusion of liability clause is unenforceable, notwithstanding the contractual construction. Here is where I think the holdings by Justice Wilson and Justice Dixon diverge. Essentially, what Justice Dixon says is that so long as unconscionability doesn't apply, we should be focusing on what the contract says, because it's very possible that parties with equality of bargaining power factored in the risk of the breach, whether it be fundamental or not, into the costs and the terms of the contract. Justice Wilson, on the other hand, essentially holds that in order to do justice among the parties and in order to ensure that there's a reasonable result, the court should have this residual discretion, and essentially the doctrine of fundamental breach should not be abolished or put to rest. Justice Dixon therefore holds that fundamental breach doesn't apply. The warranty and exclusion clause of Allis-Chalmers is upheld, and Allis-Chalmers is not responsible for the damages. Justice Wilson essentially says that because Syncrude got some benefit from the contract with Allis-Chalmers, this is not a situation where the court should exercise its discretion and render that clause unenforceable for a fundamental breach. Because there's two divergent views in this case, the outcome of this case leaves the doctrine of fundamental breach and its applicability to cases and case law moving forward in question. The question being is, in the future, do we rely on the reasoning of Justice Wilson or do we rely on the reasoning of Justice Dixon? I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and thank you to the viewers who suggested that I make this video. Take care. Have a good evening.